Good evening, and welcome to The Way Out Show. I'm your host, Dane McCarthy, broadcasting to you from FEMA Region 5, deep in the bowels of the United Police State of Amnesia. Today is August 18, 2016, and we are approaching the end of the hot spell. I think we may have already passed the end of the hot spell, and I'm hoping that we're going to get cooler weather from now on. Much of California is on fire, huge brush fires, wildfires. Al Gore has been, and other climate alarmists have been screaming that it's all about climate change, but then they arrested a serial arsonist who they charged with setting 17 wildfires in California. So if you take the firebug out of the equation, the fire season that is just beginning in California is so far about normal. So this sort of takes the wind out of the sails of people like Al Gore, who are always looking for ways to point to the catastrophe, the unbelievable catastrophe that we're headed for. Now, this is not to say that we're not headed for a catastrophe. We are, but this is a catastrophe that is happening for a purpose, and there is an agenda, and there is a very strong element within the government and above the level of government who are interested in keeping people afraid, keeping people poor, keeping people destabilized, countries destabilized, people mentally ravaged, and because that keeps the pressure off them, off their crimes. They need those distractions of the constant war, constant climate catastrophe, the crazy. They say, oh my gosh, the climate is acting so crazy. You know, it's so hot this summer. That never happened before. Oh, there's a big flood down south. That never happened before. And it's historic, never happened. None of these things ever happened, when in reality, of course, if you look in history, they've all happened before. Incredible heat waves 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago. It's all happened before. And this is not to say, like I said, there's not a catastrophe. But the catastrophe is happening because of other reasons other than carbon dioxide. Remember, carbon dioxide is the major villain and the most toxic and most dangerous gas according to the climate alarmists. They're not, and methane. But there's very little methane compared to carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is everywhere. We wouldn't even be able to survive without carbon dioxide. People don't seem to understand that. They think that it's some kind of dangerous gas that we have to try to curtail and get rid of it. Well, hello. Carbon dioxide makes plants grow, so it has a very beneficial, and it's basic to human life on planet Earth and very essential. What we have that's really truly a problem is the toxins, the pesticides that are poisoning and have been actually called a weapon of mass destruction. It's a genocidal weapon that's being used against the people of the world unnecessarily. Unnecessarily, most of these pesticides. People who grow organic food, you can grow organic food without pesticides. People, believe it or not, grew food without pesticides before pesticides were invented, which are mostly made of petrochemicals. So this is something else. This is something else that's going on that is, so along with other factors, you have the level of radioactivity gradually ramping up across the world. And there's a killing involved. There's a level of killing that is unprecedented in the environment, but it's not because of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is only a red herring meant to distract people so that the agenda can continue with the various methods of reducing the world population. Now I'm going to show you a clip. Now I'm going to sacrifice about half the show because it's a very good interview. And you have the filmmaker and his interviewer. The filmmaker made a film that just came out in July called A Very Heavy Agenda. And it's available now. A Very Heavy Agenda. It's in 3 parts. It's pretty long. So the interview was so interesting, and it gives you that I decided to show a lot of it, although the interview actually goes on for an hour and a half. I'm only going to show you the first half hour. And what's interesting about it is that it gets into the psychology of the neocons. That's what A Very Heavy Agenda is about. People like the Kagan family, people who you don't hear about that much but are extremely influential in American and world geopolitics. They are running newspapers, they have think tanks, they're consultants, they're advisors to presidents and very high-level people. And so they're the people behind the scenes. Now behind them there are other people even higher than they are, and they're not addressed. And I'm talking about the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, and the world's wealthiest families. But these guys are the second tier, right below the top. They report directly to the owner families of the planet. And they're very criminal, very psychotic, just literally, I mean, they are psycho. And they are very, very dangerous men. So let's watch that clip, and then I'll comment about it.
Hello, this is Dan Wright from Shadowproof.com, interviewing Robbie Martin, director, filmmaker of A Very Heavy Agenda film series. So far, so good. Robbie, let me ask you, what separates the 3rd installment from the other installments of the film?
Well, hi, Daniel. Thank you for having me. Well, I mean, part 3, of course, is the conclusion to the trilogy. It sounds funny even referring to it as a trilogy, but you know, it started originally as 1 movie and it ballooned into 3 over the course of working on it, just because 1 movie wasn't enough time to tell the story. So part 3. You know, it was an opportunity to kind of go over the whole Kagan family, as opposed to just Robert Kagan and some of the other neoconservatives who founded the Project for the New American Century, like, you know, Bill Kristol, Gary Schmidt. Part 1 of the movie kind of starts with the founders of Project for the New American Century, or PNAC, and kind of moves from there, showing where they went, you know, where they went after Obama became president, and what they did sort of after the war on terror became not as much of a useful narrative for them anymore. So part 3 kind of starts, I guess, in the second half of the Obama presidency, in his second term, sort of already in the midst of, you know, a Ukraine conflict, 2 proxy wars between Russia and the United States, 1 in Syria, 1 in Ukraine, and just sort of showing how the neocons helped push us into both of these situations, and how they became increasingly unhappy with the way that Obama was approaching both these situations. You know, and as someone who's very critical of the Obama administration and his foreign policy, it was surprising to me while making this movie to see that the neocons were on board with him at the very beginning, and even you know, even as hawkish and as you know, neoconservative as Obama's foreign policies were, it wasn't enough for them, and they became unhappy with it, and they started to put more pressure on him and started to sort of, you know, turn various members in the press against his foreign policy, but not against it in like a good adversarial way, but against it in the sense that they wanted him to be more hawkish. They wanted him not to do the Iran deal, all those kinds of things. They wanted him to fund more Syrian rebels in Syria. They wanted him to instate a no-fly zone and actually overthrow Assad. So anything you can imagine that would be more hawkish than what Obama's already doing, all these neoconservatives want him to do. In part 3, I guess that's sort of the starting point in part 3. And, the Kagan family in and of themselves, even though there are a lot of other war makers and neocons in D.C., I found the Kagan family in particular very fascinating because they are very, very influential and sort of, you just go one layer back into the power corridors, and it's very obvious that Robert Kagan is extremely well respected, very influential, but the difference between him and a lot of these other influential figures, everybody knows who Henry Kissinger is, for example, and some of these other famous foreign policy strategists, but Robert Kagan is someone who, I don't know if this was his intention or not, but he has managed to stay off the radar of sort of the public's understanding of foreign policy making, and by proxy, his entire family. His wife, Victoria Nuland, holds an extremely important position in the State Department. In part 3, I sort of show that her trajectory seems perfectly poised to kind of, move up to actually become Secretary of State if Hillary becomes president. And then you have Robert Kagan's sister-in-law, Kimberly Kagan, who runs arguably one of the most innocuous seeming think tanks about war in D.C. called the Institute for the Study of War. And it's barely ever questioned by anybody. And their data is used every day. And, you pick up any newspaper, major newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, New York Times. You could pick up any of these papers and find at least one analytic from the Institute for the Study of War, whether it be a map, statistics, some kind of on-the-ground reporting. And it has sort of this perception when you look at it that it's not biased, that it's just data, that these are all really hardworking people just, culling together all this data to help, inform people. But then you find out that it's all funded by defense contractors like Raytheon and stuff. This actual think tank's data, how they gather their data, and all their employees are, their salaries are paid for by weapons manufacturers.
Or go ahead, please.
Oh no, that's the end of my. My
okay, I actually, what's really interesting from my perspective of this film, as opposed to some of the other stuff, is your ability to link together a phenomenon that a lot of people don't understand, which is that there was and continues to be a propaganda mechanism within the U.S. government. People don't look at the U.S. government and see there being a propaganda mechanism, or that there's these official state media. But when and this is why it's so valuable to watch this film, is you go from Robert Kagan in the 80s, when he is with the Office of Information, and is using his powers of persuasion, using what he even calls propaganda. You have clips of him calling it propaganda, to win people over to the Nicaraguan war cause. He ultimately would be connected to Iran-Contra, but not enough to really get burned, kind of like the Iraq War. He's connected, but he doesn't really get touched. And it's interesting to see that what the Kagans, that sort of is part of the neocon apparatus, if you will, the group, is they really understand how to work with the media, because many of them not only worked within U.S. state media, but they work with media through these think tanks, whether it be the American Enterprise Institute, which is partly founded, I think, or at least led at one time by Irving Kristol, William Kristol's father. Fred Kagan's now a part of that. You have these seemingly neutral think tanks, quote-unquote neutral, with Kimberly Kagan. And you have Bob Kagan now taking a more emeritus role as a sort of elder statesman. But at the same time, you have a corresponding push by the younger neocons into things like the Interpreter mag, into things like Radio Free Liberty, Jamie Kirchick. So it kind of seems like these people one thing they may not have a lot of public support, but they really understand how to work the media. And if you could, and your film really goes into that. This one in particular. So can you expand on what do you think the linkage is between the neoconservative group and their ability to influence media and be part of it, either directly or indirectly?
Oh, I think that's one of the most important components of all this. And I mean, there's a clip I play towards the very end of the movie, and it's not too much of a spoiler because it just kind of goes along with, you know, the whole theme that you're talking about, where Donald Kagan explains that his son Robert taught him a lot about modern politics and the way that foreign policy is sort of dictated and perceived through the media. That it's that domestic politics here in this country drastically affect America's ability to sell and wage a war. That's kind of what he's saying. And I think that's a point I really wanted to drive home in part 3, is that for some reason or another, the neoconservatives are incredibly skilled at using the media as an instrument to sort of get their message out there. And before, right after 9/11, this is another thing I try to emphasize in my film, is that sort of what I would describe as a neoconservative 1.0, sort of the original iteration right after 9/11 of what neoconservatives were doing, is they were, it was almost like, I would almost describe it like a fire sale, almost like their greed was so out of control that the things they were trying to put out into the media are absurd. And that's even being kind. I mean, they're actually horrifying.
Like invade Palestine.
Yeah, they wanted to invade Palestine. They were eager for another attack to happen already on the day of 9/11. I mean, this is how greedy these people were. Even they knew that 9/11 wouldn't be enough to get some of this stuff they wanted done. So they were all, hoping that there'd be a biological attack, which there actually was, not 3 weeks after 9/11. So it's just, there's so many layers of greed and hubris that was in the original iteration of the neoconservatives. That's all, it's all out there. You can find most of it. So what I try to do is sort of show all that together, some of the worst of that, to show how originally this is how crazy they sounded in the media, and then over time they started to massage and sort of revamp and change the wording of and actually make their rhetoric, their warmongering sound more reasonable and not like obvious warmongering. They rebranded, right. And I think that is what, to me, that's what's been so impressive, is all of these people, Michael Weiss, interpreter, just, seemingly organically, they have all developed a similar skill. But then when you start peeling back the layers of like Interpreter Mag, you even find out that Peter Pomerantsev, who I would argue is one of the most skilled of these propagandists of them all, you can trace back his paper that he wrote with Michael Weiss, to an Interpreter Mag published paper. Yet when Interpreter Mag published it, it was, supposedly a private entity. That's how people perceived it. Yet it had an obvious anti-Russian leaning. But, a year and a half later, we now know that it's been bought. It's an acquired property of RFERL, a U.S. state-funded entity. So it does raise the question of, was it always a U.S. state-funded entity, just a front? Or was it actually bought out by RFERL later on? It honestly, I think both right. possibilities are equally likely.
Well, and also remember, private is interesting, but what it actually was supported by Karadovsky, one of the Russian oligarchs. His son actually started Interpreter Mag, or provided the financing for the Interpreter Mag. So
through the IMR.
Yeah. So in the case, this was a private publication, quote unquote private, funded by a disgraced Russian oligarch who, very complicated history, we can go into it. Yes, he's opposing an authoritarian government to some degree, but also, yes, he's completely guilty of what they accused him of. So it's, he's he's not a white hat and I think it's really, I don't even think he's a gray hat. I think he's a black hat, given that he said his goal is to violently overthrow the government, which would, you know, hurt a lot of people. So I don't even think that. But so there's a private entity-ish, private-ish. Now it's a state property. And I think I want to go back to something you said that was important about right after 9/11 and a larger point, or a sort of dynamic people analysis. I guess Naomi Klein wrote a book about this. A lot of people about disaster capitalism. But it's really about, and there was this famous phrase from Rahm Emanuel that became conservatives love to whine about, called a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, which is sort of a rule of politics, which is, you know, there's certain things that are openings, right? And I guess the worst example, of course, or worst historical example that comes to mind is the Reichstag fire, which the Nazis themselves set, but it provided a pretext for a real big crackdown in Germany of dissidents and other people. And so that's in case they did it. I'm not making any reference to that in this case. But once a crisis happens, people see the opportunity, and like you said, you talk about greed, but it's kind of like a shopping list. So, for example, you know, the intelligence community wanted the Patriot Act, has wanted that for years. And after 9/11 and the anthrax attacks, they didn't come up. They just sit down in a room and beat out these policies for 48 hours or something. They took all they had on the shelf and said, "Here's our opportunity to finally get it." And so it seems like when the neocons saw 9/11 happen, they said, "Here's an opportunity. Look at this. We've got almost a blank check here. Let's not just get Saddam. Let's overthrow Iran. Let's invade the Palestinian territories, even though they had nothing to do with it." And that's what the dynamic seems to be, is that the neocons very much recognize something I think everybody should recognize, which is politics is kind of, I'll quote Mao Zedong, because why not? You know, history is a boiling pot. There's kind of these moments where there's an opening, and you go in and you get everything you want. And I think the neocons seem to have understood that very well. And yes, they're greedy and they're disappointed they didn't get more, but objectively speaking, they got a lot. I mean, they got 2 wars. They got an incredible expansion of the security state. They've got now still, I mean, regime change still seems to be the order of the day. They got that from the Obama administration. So do you think, are the neocons greedy, or are they just very astute?
I think it's both. I mean, I think you have some of them who are obviously very astute and had all these. I mean, like you mentioned the Patriot Act. I mean, another example is the Hart-Rudman report, which was done under the Clinton administration, and it essentially was all the framework and all the recommendations for what the Homeland Security Agency later became. So they already had that sort of, you know, they were looking for an excuse to put in something like that as well. And but I think, you know, with Don and Fred Kagan, I think you almost have something more than just you know, being astute. I think that it was greed. I mean, I think that it's hard to make the distinction, you know, that, you know, if you line up all these neocons and say, you know, these ones were worse than some of these other ones, it's difficult to do that. But I really do think you can with Don and Fred Kagan, because, or even someone like James Woolsey, who right after 9/11, they are very clearly trying to expand it beyond just we're retaliating against the terrorists who attacked us. You know, even beyond just state actors who support terrorism. I think at one point in the phone call with Don and Fred Kagan, they actually say any entity or any group that's even thinking about doing anything like this, we should attack them regardless of if they had anything to do with this. So I think that's an interesting mindset that is you know, I would describe as very greedy and sort of chomping at the bit. It's almost, I mean, it was almost like they saw the opportunity and they just wanted to kind of, you know, break through the wall like the Kool-Aid man, you know, when they saw that's how excited they were. And they couldn't contain themselves. I mean, that's kind of how I see it. So I think it's definitely a mix.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I definitely, the way I read it, and I think Woolsey was someone who I wasn't even aware of until I started watching your films and seeing your work, because he wrote some things for the New Republic really making outlandish claims. But what I kind of see it as, and I don't know if you see it this way, it kind of got this from the film, but it wasn't, is like there's a larger worldview. And Don Kagan actually said something that echoes, ironically, the British view of a British imperial officer said of Palestine, which was, he says, the British officer said, Arabs only understand the heavy hand. And Don Kagan said, in the clip, you have the clip, says, Arabs only respect us when we're strong, which is really the same sentiment. And it seems like there's a kind of, there's a formal, things we could do. And then there's this sort of larger atmosphere we want to change, this sort of paradigm of, we need to just go out there and put a hit on somebody so people understand that they can't ever mess with us again. Mm-hmm. And we don't really care exactly if we hit the right people because it's not really about specific objectives. It's about sending a larger message.
Absolutely.
And that of course is a recipe for unrestrained violence and limitless unintended consequences. So what do you think of that? That's really about this larger struggle that isn't even necessarily grounded in reality. It's just sort of a sort of mental space struggle that other people aren't even necessarily perceiving.
Well, I think I think that's the larger thing that's going on here. I definitely think, and I hesitate to use the word psyop because it's usually associated with some kind of like CIA or black operation kind of thing. But I do think what some of these neocons were doing is they were sort of putting out this intentional psyop kind of mindset that it wasn't just about retaliating against people, or striking terrorists that are harboring other terrorists. I mean, I'm sure on some surface level that was their sales pitch, but I think what you just hit on is the greater was their reasoning for going to do this is almost kind of like a mafia-like symbolic intimidation on a global scale. And you can hear it most evidently in James Woolsey's remarks, where he's saying that we're not going to get caught up in legal niceties. We're not going to have to be, we're not going to be put up to the burden of proof about why we're going to attack Iraq or any other country in response to 9/11. We're just going to do this, and everybody's pretty much just going to have to get out of our way. And I think that's the more important sort of neocon talking point that they tried to put out, right after 9/11, which arguably, if you combine it with a lot of the other stuff on 9/11, like the dancing Palestinian footage that was shown on television, things like that. It really did, I believe, activate sort of a very visceral, bloodthirsty reaction inside of us that, for some people right now, Donald Trump is doing that in them. Sort of this, like, we need to blow up the whole Middle East, we need to let them fight each other and pick up the remnants. It's a similar mindset, but I think I would argue it was far more dangerous when it was put out there on 9/11 because of what was happening, at the time. We were in a state of emotional hysteria, and the neocons, I don't think that they were. You could argue, right, they got caught up in it. I don't think they did. That's the scary part. They were very, very level-headed while they were putting out this stuff, and they knew what they were putting out. And to me, that's the frightening and most dangerous part about this, is they took advantage of a very intense, scary time to try to tip the balance in a very dangerous direction. And I would argue that they largely succeeded in doing that. We kind of got a pause from sort of the ramping up Islamophobia, terrorism hysteria, before ISIS sort of came out of nowhere, and now it's kind of just back on again. I feel like that trajectory, that ramping up effect that the neocons created is now, we're back in it. And to me, it's frightening.
And that goes to a point that you made in your film that I think is very interesting about, probably, I think, Bob Kagan is the case in point, but has also been made by other journalists in the ramp up to Syria, which is this idea that, you talked about the ramp up about after 9/11. What stopped them was not the American public or the electorate. What stopped them was Iraq. They got what they wanted. They just couldn't handle what they wanted. They got what they asked for. They got the war they asked for, and then the U.S. was, I know this might be controversial to say, pretty much defeated, and at least its stated objectives, which were pretty stupid. But so even its real objectives, I'm not sure have really worked out. So it's not like the neocons were ever intellectually defeated in any sense. Their policies failed, and then as soon as their policies failed, they jumped away, retreated, and left, George Bush and these other figures, Rumsfeld, to just sit there and take all the fire, waited it out, and then lurched on to the next group, or latched on to the next group. And that's what's interesting about, some of the reporters said, why should the people who led us into Iraq, or the media, particularly the pundits and journalists who advocated Iraq, why do they still have jobs? Why do they do it? It's such a disaster. And you also point out that Bob Kagan has been completely rehabilitated, that he sort of smartly stepped away from the more extremist elements of the neocons, the people who really, I think, unmuzzled themselves, not just Woolsey, but like Ledeen, although I'm not sure that guy ever muzzles himself. But and that they kind of wrote it out and have moderated their views, sort of changed it around, and except for Bill Kristol, who I think has been pretty well discredited, mostly by his own actions, it seems like the neocons are still going very strong. So talk about the lack of consequence for poor advocacy, because that's what it looks like to me. It looks like they ramped up, took advantage, and then most of them are sitting pretty and are positioning themselves to be with the Clinton administration, the next Clinton administration.
Yeah, I mean, it seems almost like there's no accountability. I mean, even like someone like Bill Kristol, who is not taken seriously by most people, he's considered a joke. Even he still gets on television, all the time. He has semi-permanent gigs on ABC. He's always on CNN and MSNBC. So it really doesn't seem like ultimately there is any accountability for these people. And then you have like people like Richard Pearl and Michael Ledeen, who are maybe a little more tarnished. They didn't really survive. I mean, they're still probably working now, but I would argue that somehow they didn't survive as well as Bill Kristol did. He still is obviously making quite a bit of money appearing on TV and stuff. And, the Weekly Standard is still doing well, apparently, even though Donald Trump says it's tanking. He couldn't remember the name of it several times when he talked about it. But yeah, no, it is interesting, and I this is maybe a crass analogy to use, but it does kind of remind me of like a battered wife syndrome, kind of almost like a Stockholm syndrome kind of effect, where it's like, I mean, that actually maybe a better way to say this is, I think that we all hold some blame. I include myself in this, and I would include any journalist, who allowed any ground to be taken by these neocons, and that's happened so many times since 9/11 that it's really hard to count them all up. I mean, and I harp on this point a lot, and I annoy Abby with it sometimes because I bring it up on the podcast all the time. But the Afghanistan war is something that I think that because we didn't really push hard enough against that and sort of the moral framework for that, just that alone, I think, allows the neocons to be able to continue and to be able to almost out-argue us, for example, because there's a scene I use in part 3 during the section about ISIS, and it's kind of a scene that goes by really fast. It's maybe not that noteworthy, but the point that the guy makes to Bill Kristol is really interesting, because he's like, we're not going to listen to you and get into a third war in the Middle East, a third endeavor in the Middle East. And Bill Kristol's like, well, what was the first war? What was the second war? The first war was Afghanistan. Like, you didn't disagree with that, did you?
Right.
Like, we should have done that.
Exactly.
So it's almost kind of like, I mean, I have to give the neocons credit that they are excellent at debating people and being very manipulative at it, because the left has a lot of what I would argue weak spots, where the neocons can sort of jab into those spots and be like, well, you supported this. I mean, and an interesting example of that, and this kind of hinted to me that Hillary Clinton was getting some advice from some neocons, or maybe even Robert Kagan, is there was a point during that Chris Matthews interview, that really surprisingly adversarial one, where she brings up that Bernie Sanders voted for sort of the overthrowing Saddam bill that was passed in I think in 1999 or actually maybe even 2000 under Bill Clinton, that Bernie Sanders voted for that, which the neocons at that time knew that bill was sort of an underhanded way to eventually get to overthrowing Saddam Hussein. It was sort of like a bill, pledging to support, the rebels or whoever was opposed to him, to take him out of office. And I think that that's an interesting example of just how, I guess what I'm saying is that
right, they box people in. What they do is say, it's like, look, you agree with our objective, right? And once people say that, and then they say, well, then this is just a question of tactics, and we don't think your tactics work. The only way to defeat that is to say, no, I don't agree with your objective, and I don't agree with your worldview. But what Democrats and liberal interventionists never say, or have no interest in saying, is we disagree with your objectives. So, for example, when the neocons come out and say, Assad's a terrible man, he's the next Hitler, we got to get rid of him, he's destroying people, and people say, yes, we agree. Okay, we need to go to war in Syria. Well, we're not sure we're ready for a war. Oh, so you're okay with, you just said Assad to be overthrown, so you're okay with mass murder and barrel bombs? So I think the liberals are just suckers. They're such suckers, and they get boxed in, and then they look like they're weak, because they're saying they believe in something, and then every time they're asked about ways to achieve it, they look like they don't have the power of their convictions, that they believe in things but they're not willing to execute, when the actual response to neoconservatism is to say, no, I don't agree with your objectives. Your objectives are wrong. Your worldviews are wrong. America is not an exceptional nation. Imperialism is wrong.
So there you have it. That's about the first 29 and a half minutes of a very interesting interview for the film A Very Heavy Agenda, which is a documentary in 3 parts. It's brand new, and it is available online. There is I think you can see on YouTube a trailer or a clip of the film if you're interested in just seeing part of it. But it really is extremely informative and gets into an area that a lot of people don't know very much about, and that is the mindset of the neocons who are so influential in American politics. They are an ongoing group of men, mostly men, who have been around for quite some time, and they're not going away. They are representative of the military-industrial the military-industrial complex. They are crucial to that agenda, and that would be endless war. And it's not only because there's tens or hundreds of billions or even trillions of dollars to be made for companies, corporations like Raytheon, and all the war makers, the people who make the bombs, the airplanes, the ordnance, who are putting the depleted uranium into all of the ordnance above our 50 caliber and above, and it's spreading radioactive poison around wherever they bomb, wherever they have that battlefield, and this is literally turning the planet into a dead zone way more than any climate change possibly ever could. And it's forever, because it spreads, it's aerosolized. That depleted uranium, when that shell explodes, all that depleted uranium aerosolizes. It's not gone. And it's blown around by the dust, and in a dusty place like the Middle East, it's particularly dangerous. And you've seen in countries like Iraq particularly a very sharp increase in the number of serious birth defects horrific birth defects in places like Fallujah, particularly, that were heavily bombed. They virtually leveled that city as revenge, I think, for those 4 Blackwater guys who got strung up by an angry mob in Fallujah in the very early days of the invasion. So this is something that people have to recognize. But these insane men really don't care. And you can tell by just looking in their eyes that they are insane. They didn't mention Brent Scowcroft or Zbigniew Brzezinski, but they're right in there in that group. There's a lot of them, like Douglas Feith, they didn't talk about him. Wolfowitz, they didn't mention him. But they are, Richard Pearl, they did briefly talk about him. Richard Pearl, his nickname is the Prince of Darkness. I mean, these guys are evil. They are evil. Henry Kissinger, they mentioned him. Of course, he's notorious. Interestingly, on a side note, Hillary Clinton is very proud of her friendship with Henry Kissinger, gets advice from him. So, I mean, I'm not saying that Trump is perfect, but I think that as far as the pure level of pure criminality and dangerous attitude and willingness to kill, I would say that Hillary Clinton as president would be more dangerous than Trump in terms of just the dead count, the body count that we would run into with Hillary Clinton as president is the prospect is absolutely horrific. I thought it was interesting during the interview when they were talking about Obama that even though Obama had a very neocon agenda, it still wasn't extreme enough for the neocons. I thought that was interesting. And so it's really important for the American people to understand who is the adversary. Who is the true adversary? Is it Russia? The neocons would like to make Russia the adversary. Was it Saddam Hussein? Is it Assad? Was it Gaddafi in Libya? Were they the true adversary? No. It's not about, and they made this clear in the interview, it's not about whether or not a dictator is a bad guy, is a brutal authoritarian dictator. The American leadership and the imperialists do not care whether or not a dictator is a brutal dictator or not. They will use him, they will befriend him if it suits their purposes. They will ally with him or her. They will go along with his agenda unless he gets too big for his britches and tries to really take over his neighbors, become the big dog in the neighborhood. Then he gets swatted down, he gets put in his place, he gets destroyed, and this is what has already happened. In Libya, perfect example, and Saddam Hussein both, in Iraq, both these countries, perfect examples of prosperous countries in their area of the world, the Middle East and Africa. Libya, by Gaddafi, was elevated to the level of the most successful country in Africa. Very wealthy, a lot of gold that Gaddafi had accumulated. And this is important because his plan was to use that gold to leverage his wealth and power and with a currency backed up by gold, which makes it stronger. Because people know, hey, this currency is backed by gold. I can take this note, and if I can get this exchanged for gold if I want to. And this gives people confidence. Currency is, the value of a currency is all about the confidence that people have that it will retain its value. And both Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi had this idea that they could enhance their power in the region by a strong currency and even displace the dollar, because the world's assets are right now traded in dollars. And if that can be the dollar can be knocked off as the favored currency, then the status and power of the United States is diminished to the same extent that currency, the dollar, has been diminished, the value has been diminished, and the confidence that people have. When people start getting away from the dollar, you will see the power in the world of the United States go down. And it's happening. It's been happening. And this is, of course, inevitable. It's inevitable. Every country, the major countries in the world throughout history, they have had their day in the sun. Through a combination of circumstances, it may be only a very short period, or it may be 200 years, 400 years, 1,000 years. But eventually, that country will be eclipsed by the power of another country for one reason or another. And usually what it is that the leadership simply becomes corrupt, complacent, and really that trickles down to the whole population. They don't have that drive. They don't have the will to sustain the level of engagement that is required for them to maintain power on the world stage. And it's over. It's a little bit like the story of a life, of a human life. You're born, like the United States, we're born, we're teenagers, we're children, we're teenagers, we're young adults, we're full adults in the height of our power and efficiency. Then we gradually decline and then die. And this is the way countries are. Maybe not completely die, but you go into a long kind of middle-aged or old age. I mean, there are countries that exist for thousands of years. France has, well, how long has France been a country? Maybe 800 to 1,000 years, because before France became a country, a single country, it was principalities, little kingdoms, little monarchies, and run by tribal chieftains, essentially. And it wasn't molded into a single country until maybe hundreds of years later. Germany, the same way. Germany, until fairly recently, was, within a couple hundred years ago, was a bunch of small countries, and they gradually welded into one country. England, for instance, Wales used to be its own country. England was run by a group of petty kings who would war with each other periodically, partly just to give their knights something to do, and partly for wealth. And this kind of warfare, this tribal warfare, goes back to the very beginnings of human civilization, where you have the very earliest writings, the epics, like Gilgamesh and like the Nordic epics, are about, and like in India, Mahabharata, you have people raiding other villages or other little kingdoms looking for wealth, maybe cattle or something. Cattle raids. So they raid each other. And so now what we have is the establishment of an institution, of an industry. It's a war industry. It's an industry of death. And there's also an agenda which is about maintaining the power of a small group of men maybe as many as 3,000 to 5,000 people at the very pinnacle of wealth and power. Not necessarily people who are in the news, who are celebrities, because they deliberately stay out of the limelight. They don't want people to notice them. So they stay in the shadows. And people would think, well, you know, they're not even, are they still around even? Do these people even exist? Those people who are, we are told, are the richest people on the planet, people like Bill Gates, are not. They are not the richest people. There's even been stories about, I guess, saying that some guy in Mexico is supposed to be the world's richest man. Since when? Since when? No. It's the old money from hundreds of years ago that has been building, not the nouveau riche who only got their money 20 years ago. And sure, maybe they're worth trillions, or not trillions, but maybe they're worth tens of billions, or even maybe 100 billion or something. That's a lot of money. But the very richest people are now at the point where their assets are worth trillions, tens of trillions. They essentially own the planet. We don't know it. They don't want us to know it, because there's still people, and the angry mob with the pitchforks and the torches could come and, you know, haul them out of their mansions and their gated compounds and their castles, or from their mountain fastness or their tropical islands where they live. They own the whole island. And they have a little army guarding the place. Then that can happen. So that's very important for their security, is that we don't know about them. We don't know who they are. That's essential. That would be the main way that their safety is ensured. Our ignorance. They rely on our ignorance. And those in power always do. That's just how they operate. So yeah, I mean, awareness is everything. So I would encourage anyone, if they're interested in following up this topic about who the neocons are, what their agenda is, what the history of the neocons is, and you also have the neoliberals too, which are very similar. Their agenda is very similar. I don't know why they bother to call them neocons and neoliberals. Their purpose is essentially the same. Hillary Clinton is considered to be a neoliberal, but she works with these neocons. I guess they identify as Republicans. It's really not even fair to call them conservatives, to call them neoconservatives. You think of Republican when we hear the word conservative. It's just absolutely not fair. There's nothing conservative about them. These are globalists. I think a globalist would be a better term than a neoconservative, because that could encompass a lot of different groups who have similar goals. Yeah, Bill Gates is a good example of a globalist. And he believes that we need to get rid of countries, national borders. Nationalism is bad. You don't want to be loyal to your country. We're all citizens of the world. But how does that shake out? When we're all citizens of the world and we live in a world without borders, in which anyone can move anywhere without fear of reprisals or even having a passport or a visa or being checked at the border, when we all can just hop on a plane or get on a boat or drive in a car and get there where we want to go and just do our thing. Now, the one place we won't be allowed to go is in those places that are set aside for the elite. You can bet that they're not going to let ordinary folks move in the vicinity of where they are. And that's the way it will be. You'll have areas where the elite go and that are off limits to ordinary people. And they will be the most prosperous areas, the most beautiful areas, the most pristine areas, and everyone else will be shoved into bigger and bigger cities that are packed together. It's called smart growth, where you destroy the economies of countries. You destroy their borders. You get rid of their personal sovereignty. You take away people's ability to decide what is going to happen in their county, in their city, in their country, in their lives, in their personal lives. You rob them, you starve them, you poison them, and you often kill them, and that's how you control them. The ultimate form of control is the bullet to the back of the head. That's control in its purest form. Or the long, slow death by poisoning, which is one that's favored because if you don't know who's doing it to you, or you don't know why it's doing it to you, you're not going to be able to know who to come after before your end comes, or who to tell your relatives to go after, or your friends to go after. They won't know, and that's the way they want it to be. So we have to think in terms of what has happened in the past, what is happening now, and what, through the information that we've gathered, is likely to happen in the future, and how to avoid that if we don't feel that this would be a course that would be beneficial for humanity. Now, a lot of people would say, but I don't care about humanity. I like the idea that humanity will be destroyed to a large extent. There are actually many, many people who think that humanity is a virus on the planet. Humanity is dangerous. Okay, so running out of time. That's all for this week. Sleep well and have a great weekend.